I've been in too many Baptist churches. First, let me thank Adria for inviting me. She's referred to our little group of friends. There are about 7 of us. So we've met for about 3 years now. We call our little circle Sacred Inquiry. We're learning not to interrupt each other. And Rick is a part of that, and happy to see him here. And I also want to acknowledge my friend George, who came with me today. I'm very happy to have him here with me. I want to give you a few words about my background, simply because in this digital age, I still find it useful to place people geographically. I'm a New England Yankee. I grew up raised in Massachusetts and Connecticut, and I was schooled in Boston, Tufts, as Adria mentioned, and lived most of my adult life in Vermont. Work took me briefly to New York City, but in 2011, I left Vermont and came to Rhode Island with 2 teenagers in tow because my husband had died and I was lured by the ocean. After some 8 years down here in South County, I moved to Warwick. I bought a house in Oakland Beach in Warwick and now live on the Atlantic. I say that they're taking me out of that house feet first. I do not understand the mystery of grace, only that it meets us where we are and does not leave us where it found us. This is a quote from the incomparable Anne Lamott, author and public philosopher. Grace, by definition, is always unexpected and undeserved. It just occurs, and you are changed profoundly and seemingly forever. And even more expected than grace itself was my vehicle of grace, which was death. A death which was the most profound loss of my life, and yet, at one and the same time, a portal into a new life. I find I am grateful for the thing that I most wish hadn't happened. I'm going to say that again. I find I am grateful for the thing I most wish hadn't happened. But let me back up a little bit. My feminist activist bona fides can't be denied. A founding collective member of Haymarket People's Fund in Boston, we raised money from the rich and gave it to the activist poor around New England. I went from there to work with Gloria Steinem, bless her. That's when I was in New York, and then ended up leading the State Women's Commission in Vermont for social, economic, and political gender equity. I have always been lucky enough to be paid for my social justice efforts, and my work was not simply work, but my life. During these years, decades, I truly believed that my job was to make people aware of the right ideas, i.e. mine, and they would just fall in behind me. If that didn't happen, I simply needed to work harder. These social justice efforts of mine began before college graduation and lasted through my 50s. Along the way, I adopted 2 infants from Guatemala that Adria mentioned, now 31 and 28, and married Bruce. That's how it felt. I did my work, and along the way, over 5 short years, made a family. And that family, that marriage and children, held many unknown and unexpected surprises. And it held grace. Bruce and my relationship was unusual from the beginning. I told him he had shown up in my life at a highly inconvenient time. I was most of the way through an adoption process as a single woman, and the powers that be wanted stability. He hung in, and eventually, after I brought Alex home from Guatemala, Bruce and I adopted him and subsequently married. A year into our marriage, Bruce was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. A man of great humor, he loved to joke that he was never sick a day in his life until he met me. He gave me an out from the marriage. I declined. Then, after about a year, he made a declaration. He said, I'm going to make this disease a gift to myself and other people. I had no idea what he was talking about. And then I watched while he did that. My beloved Bruce, who got Parkinson's in the year after our marriage and then fulfilled his stated purpose for the disease to make it a contribution to himself and others. My beloved Bruce, who had a rock solid twice daily meditation practice, which he told me allowed himself to see the beauty inside. My beloved Bruce, who had prostate cancer, which he beat before he got a glioblastoma, brain cancer, which almost always kills. My beloved Bruce, who I had 17 years with in the flesh, and whose presence after death only grows, not diminishes with time. My witty, sometimes silly husband, who had managed to transform himself into a fountain of love through his meditation practice, faced certain death unafraid. Bruce had the ability to move toward rather than away from life when his body itself was moving further and further out of his control. He was the kind of dying person who brought comfort to the living. Visitors would enter his bedroom hesitant, shoulders hunched, afraid. Half an hour later, they're striding out, shoulders back, laughing, again and again. It was hard to comprehend and sometimes hard to live with. He would say things like, I'm the happiest almost dead man I know. I'd tell him to stop showing off. Through the vagaries of this awful cancer, he always knew me. Sometimes he didn't know my name, but he knew me. And he always included me. His spirit very rarely flagged. Eventually, he wrapped me deeply into his death. No turning away, no pretending otherwise. Hours before he died, he suddenly pulled me fiercely onto the hospital bed and wrapped his arms around me. I broke the embrace after 7 hours, and I sat on the bed facing him. Holding hands, I told him that it was time to go. I named everybody in the room. Bruce raised his arms into the sky, our hands locked. He dropped his arms, and when he dropped them, he was gone. Of course I grieved him. I still grieve him. But some part of me knew that the passing of a being like this was hallowed. I uprooted myself after his death, moved our 2 teenagers from Vermont to Rhode Island, much to their displeasure, and restarted life as a widow. But I was changed. In fact, I was graced, but I didn't know it yet. Inexplicably and repeatedly, new words were coming into my head, seemingly out of nowhere. Paradox, non-duality, the Eucharist. It didn't occur to me that these words were spiritual. I didn't think about going to church. I hadn't been to church in decades. I just naturally did what Bruce would have done in that circumstance. I dove in, head first, hard and deep. I began to study these unusual words floating around me. I began with yoga teacher training, then studied the philosophy underpinning yoga. I met Buddhists, and the Buddhists inspired, that's where we first met, and studied books with them. I learned of small groups listening to videos of Adyashanti and other wisdom masters and studied with them. Along the way, I found a meditation teacher, and over time eventually came into my own meditation practice, which continues today. I started attending silent retreats, and after bailing a few times, came to love extended silence. I read and read, studied and studied, trusting my intuition to pull me forward. I couldn't get enough, and eventually realized I wanted to put spiritual study at the center of my life, not just weekends and evenings. I was struck repeatedly to learn how Eastern spiritual gurus spoke of Jesus with such love and reverence. I learned of Father Richard Rohr, a Franciscan who had founded a school focused on contemplation, hand in hand with action, a place where I could study mystical or contemplative Christianity for 2 years, 10 hours or more a week. I signed up and came away from the first meeting knowing I needed to read the Bible. So I did, 20 minutes a day for a year and a half, and learned that this method of reading a few minutes daily, working your way through a daunting, dense volume, could work. It also works with things like poetry, which I can't sit down and read in one fell swoop. In time, I found that I could bring Rohr's conception of Christ, a universal Christ, into my life and live through it. I began to see everything around me, not just humans, but rocks and trees and weeds, as divine. As Rohr says, we do not think our way into a new way of living. We live ourselves into a new way of thinking. In 19, I finished Rohr's Living School and finished my training as a spiritual director. Basically, someone available to listen to people about how spirit or the divine or God, the name is not relevant, moves, works in their lives. In 21, I learned of death doulas, and upon hearing that phrase, knew that this was my true calling. I trained as an end-of-life doula and now work weekly in the hospice in Providence. As Adria mentioned, last year I co-founded with a young woman a collaborative of death doulas and others seeking alternative ways of moving through the death of loved ones. I now have the routine privilege of being in liminal space, a thin place, with people within days, even hours, minutes of their deaths. I tell them when I can, and their family members too, that love is stronger than death. And I know that grace, unexpected and unearned, can enter you unbidden and change you forever. Thank you.